I'm Rae Jereza. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be on this panel. This talk focuses on my ethnography of content moderation, which, as Hermione said, I've been doing remotely during the COVID-19 pandemic, as I'm sure is the case for lots of folks trying to do ethnography all over the world. So it is my hope that this research will open possibilities for attending to the sensory dimensions of experience in linguistic anthropology and demonstrate, on the other hand, for multisensory anthropologists that words in and of themselves are sensory. Okay, there we go. So I've been conducting research involving content moderators. Content moderators are the workers who review user-generated content on social media platforms. So this is very sort of in the news right now because of what happened in the US with the coup attempt and Trump. And he's since been taken down by multiple platforms and his supporters have been deplatformed as well. So I've been talking to these content moderators, mostly for Facebook, tech journalists and civil society organizations in the US and Ireland for 10 months now, mostly very low tech, meaning just messaging people on different apps. From these digitally mediated correspondences, I have learned that content moderation is more than a job performed by certain workers. Rather, it is an ecology of practices, relations, and structures aimed at solving the problem of objectionable content. So when we say objectionable content, that tends to mean things like hate speech, misinformation, sexual exploitation, imagery, and other forms of violence on social media platforms. The other thing I have learned is that content moderators bear the effective burden of solving this problem. The content moderators I talk to are underpaid workers who labor for third-party vendors that provide content moderation services for tech giants. Many are traumatized from their work, overwhelmed by the pressures of actioning their cues accurately, that is, making decisions to remove or ignore content, and have been diagnosed with mental health issues such as PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Content moderators' accounts of their work involve the negotiation of ethical convictions, the suppression of bodily reactions like nausea, and the engagement in coping practices such as drinking and smoking marijuana during their breaks to distract from their toxic work environments and the content they have to see on a daily basis. So I've started to conceptualize their labor as a type of sensory knowledge work. In other words, content moderation as labor performed by precarious workers isn't just about applying policies to content users' posts on social media mechanically. It involves the management of corporeal dimensions like feelings, sensations, and other bodily phenomena to get the job done. So this talk focuses more on how I became attuned to the way content moderators have placed me in their realities despite our spatiotemporal separation through narrative maneuvers that simulate the sensory dimensions of their behavior. It is by attending to the linguistic aspects of our text-based digitally mediated interactions that I have come to understand their labor as corporeal. While it is impossible for me to occupy the same spatial-temporal spaces as my interlocutors because of the pandemic, we nevertheless co-construct place through conversation. So here I am drawing on Harry England's conceptualization of emplacement as a perspective in which the subject is inextricably situated in a historically and existentially specific condition defined for brevity as a place. I argue that people can emplace each other through narratives and stance-taking practices that transpose people into sensory conditions that then constitute place. And I'm going to do this, I'm going to demonstrate this by showing an excerpt, an analysis of a conversation with an interlocutor that I had on WhatsApp. So in doing sensory anthropology, Pink devotes an entire chapter to the sensoriality of the interview, which is, I think, the closest that my work comes, my work is best described, I would say, probably as interview-based, even though it's, it's very conversational. and ongoing all-day texting, messaging interlocutors. So moving beyond considering the interview as conversation or narrative, Pink underscores how verbal exchange taken together with, quote, cups of tea and coffee, comfortable cushions, movement or performance, odors, textures, sounds, and images constitute emplaced ways of knowing. So she conceptualizes the interview as an event that can involve verbal communication, but is not limited to it. She understands verbal exchange itself as a way to access local sensory meanings and categories, which can be communicated directly or through sensory metaphors. As she writes, quote, attention to the way people use sensory metaphors to express their experiences, comment on their own and other people's moralities, and the qualities of their social relationships can offer important insights. So likewise, Klassen and House underscore the role of discourse as a means to access these sensory models, which have moral implications. They draw on examples from the mythology of the Dishonor people of the Colombian Amazon and show how sensory phenomena like colors, flavors, and smells described in myths, sayings, and stories are imbued with moral significance that function as behavioral guidelines for interacting with the environment and with each other. Here, sensory categories that emerge through discourse are understood again as significant insofar as they point to sensory meanings. Departing from thinking about sensory discourse to get at existing cultural models or categories, Harris and Guillemin contend that sensory discourse can afford the researcher access to people's experiences that do not quite fit into existing models. In doing so, they highlight the way people talk about the senses in ways that describe emergent phenomena, experiences that may be fleeting or difficult to pin down. At the same time, they still treat discourse as a portal rather than constitutive of place itself. Like many who utilize sensory methods, Harris and Guillemin consider talk in relation to the physical, in-person conditions of the interview encounter. So sensory anthropology's critique of textual biases, not only in anthropology, but also in the humanities and the social sciences more broadly, is valuable and expands our view of what it means to be human in this world. Reading the works of sensory anthropologists have allowed me to understand content moderation as sensory labor. However, in order to do this, given the form my research is taking right now, it entails shifting my understanding of text-based interaction from portal or means of access to actually constitutive of place itself. The material conditions of my research are not rooted in things like shared food, cups, or movements through city streets, but in shared infrastructure, the signal towers, devices, and fiber optic tables, also built by precarious laborers, that facilitate our ability to talk to each other despite pandemic and geographical constraints. At the same time, sensing is not limited to directly experiencing phenomena with one's own body. I basically show that stories can stimulate the senses, placing the audience in existential conditions bounded by space and time, as scholars of narrative have noted. Thus, I am able to gain some sense of content moderators' realities through our mutual efforts at attending to their bodily experiences. As I show, discourse itself can be sensory in ways that place talk participants. So here's my example. This is a WhatsApp change with an interlocutor I'm calling Will. Will is a Facebook content moderator that lives in Ireland, with whom I have been in contact with since I began this research in March. And I think that this exchange illustrates this process of emplacement through narrative well. So I'm just going to read this briefly. So Will says, imagine sitting at your desk 5 minutes after Trump posted, when the looting starts, the shooting starts in the summer in response to the BLM protests, before Mark Zuck has been made aware of it and reached a decision. You have to make a decision now based on the rules as they are written that you can defend to your auditors. Get it wrong, your quality score goes down. You might get fired. And I respond, so high stakes. TBH, I don't know how I would rule, and that's a scary thought. Then he says, apparently it was a quote from some bigot in the 60s. Does that change things? What if you don't know it's a quote? it doesn't specifically mention people of color, conversations that occur through messaging apps are transcribed verbatim. Original punctuation, grammar, and capitalization are maintained. So here he's referring to Facebook's decision to ignore Trump's post against anti-racist protesters, despite Trump's use of the phrase, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. The phrase, for those of you who might not know, is controversial because it is a recontextualization of Miami Police Chief Walter Headley's racist comment during a 1960s hearing on crime and Miami PD's mistreatment of the Black community. Bauman and Briggs argue that discourses turn into text through intextualization, or the process of rendering discourse extractable, of making a stretch of linguistic production into a unit, a text, that can be lifted out of its natural setting. Once a text is extracted from its initial context, it can be recontextualized or used in another discourse setting. Crucially, this process lends new social meaning to the intextualized utterance, and it becomes the analyst's task to determine what the recontextualized text brings with it from its earlier contexts, and what emergent form, function, and meaning it is given as it is recentered in discourse. So in the case of Trump's post, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, present and past discursive context overlap so that racialized functions and meanings are retained or reproduced. The phrase, as it was used in the 60s and as it is used in 2020, share the social baggage of racial politics in American society, characterized by ongoing state violence against Black communities predicated on their social death. Under this formulation, property is understood as more valuable than Black lives, and looting is understood as an offense punishable by lethal violence. Here, the content moderator's task, if, hypothetically they encounter this, as my interlocutor explains, is to weigh the social baggage of this phrase against Facebook's policies that do not account for this historical context. Indeed, Facebook's implementation standards, the document, one of the many documents that content moderators for Facebook consult when they are making decisions on different types of content, require that protected classes such as Black, Indigenous, and people of color be explicitly mentioned for a piece of content to count as hate speech. Implicit in Will's explanation is this calculation. Leave Trump's post up and you might cause harm. Remove it and you might get fired. To convey what is at stake in actioning this piece of content, Will places me in a hypothetical scenario. So he says, imagine sitting at your desk 5 minutes after Trump posted. In the absence of a physical field site where I might observe such calculations, he asks me to imagine not only a time and place, but also how a contingent moderator might feel. In doing so, he leads me into ethnographic place, juxtaposing certain pressures and standards of productivity with the social life of Trump's post to simulate the sensory experience of moderation. So I respond, I say, I feel conflicted and I am ambivalent. I express my own uncertainties as I try to imagine the content moderator's predicament. To be honest, I don't know how I would rule in this situation, and thus participate in constructing the place Will has offered up to me, voicing the kind of distress one might feel when placed in a situation all too typical for content moderators. So from a linguistic, anthropological, specifically narrative studies perspective, Will transposes me into the story world of content moderation through discursive maneuvers in the storytelling event, laminating two distant spatial temporal contexts. So I wanted to animate this slide, but I don't know how to do that. So imagine these two boxes sort of like coming together, laminating, right? So the story world, the there and then hypothetical scenario of a content moderator perhaps coming across this post, and the storytelling event, meaning the WhatsApp chat I'm having with Will. So he does so through the use of the pronoun you, or also through narrating his story in the second person. So imagine sitting at your desk, you have to make the decision now. Your quality score goes down, you might get fired. So these are all sort of linguistic maneuvers that he uses in his narrative in order to create a sense of place for me, right? And create a sense of the sensations one might feel if you were to encounter this post. And then I align with that perspective with what I perceive as his attempt to transpose me into the story world by taking a stance in relation to his hypothetical scenario, thus further solidifying the lamination of two distinct spatiotemporal contexts using evaluative statements such as, "That's a scary thought." Du Bois defines stance taking as the way social actors simultaneously evaluate objects, position subjects, themselves and others, and align with other subjects with respect to any salient dimension of the social cultural field. In this example, I align with Will's narrative by articulating how the scenario has placed me, meaning how it makes me feel ambivalent and scared of this ambivalence. I would like to think that I am the type of person who would take down such a harmful post, but if I were a content moderator, as Will notes, I only have a few minutes to decide, and taking down the post might violate Facebook's implementation standards. Crucially, this active alignment signals to Will that I am invested in the story and that I am trying to approximate what it must feel like to have to review such an overtly racist post without compromising my political convictions. Through text, I communicate that I am sensing alongside him, attempting to grasp the inner turmoil such a scenario might generate and thus co-construct place with him. So finally, our participation in this narrative is a good example of how interview methods not only point to sensory meanings or existing sensory categories, but also generate sensations and constitute place itself. In this example, my interlocutor is not only communicating culturally known and understood categories, he's describing emergent phenomena perhaps unique to the existential realities of third-party content moderators who must manage their feelings to maintain job security in a neoliberal economy. When he prompted me to imagine myself in this scenario, I felt a tightness in my chest and butterflies in my stomach. I glossed these sensations as fear, but I also felt helplessness, shame, frustration, and doubt. We do not necessarily have words for this constellation of sensations and feelings, and what I felt does not even begin to scratch the surface of what content moderators experience daily. But through discursive maneuvers, my interlocutor and I were able to approximate the realities of moderators, leading me to a better appreciate content moderation as an embodied experience. Thank you.